Hello. Um, Thank you all for joining us today in this wonderful Talk Nerdy to Me event. Um, I have a crying puppy underneath me, so please forgive any kind of like odd squeaking noises you hear. Um, yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. Thinking Books has been putting on Talk Nerdy to Me events for almost 5 years now, which is crazy. We started doing these as a kind of creative technology, nerdy support to our clients and partners to help kind of inspire us and spark ideas and think about how we can think about things differently. We've since expanded this to be webinars during the pandemic and also to more than just our technology, although today we are very much talking technology. I'm sure some of you have been to our old events. We've done many on kinds of content and AR and most recently media. But today we are going to be talking about interactive web. And so we're talking about the evolution of experience, web in an interactive context. We're so excited to share this with you. It's a really important topic, I think, just in how we all access the internet in general. But on top of that, and selfishly for me, because I love this stuff, we want to talk about how we can do things different, what tools are out there, why we might want to use these kinds of tools, what does it mean for the world today, and then specifically, we'll get into some really key kind of technologies, tools, protocols, get really nerdy, but don't worry, we'll explain some use cases. And yeah, we're really excited to share that. So I'll introduce my colleagues that are going to be chatting with us today. Obviously, I'm Christine. I'm the managing director in Toronto and resident nerd. My colleagues, Helen Androlia, our director of strategy, will be doing the upfront and some of our history lesson today. And then last but not least, Cody Hart, who is web genius. He won't say it, but I will. And he's our senior creative technologist in Vancouver. And he works on all of the weird and wonderful webby things we do, and is the best person to be speaking about this today. So we've got a lot to go through. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the upfront. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Helen to get started on sites that tell, not show.
Thank you so much, Christine. And so Christine has a puppy. I admit I live on a very busy street, so occasionally you will hear what I'd like to think is drag racing, but it's really just people driving by. I apologize in advance. So I'm going to try and go through this as quickly as possible because the fact of the matter is you don't really want to hear me talk. You want to hear Cody talk because Cody is the guy who makes the magic happen. Right now, Cody's like, oh God, please stop talking about me. But that is in fact the truth. And so the reason why we land on this, the idea of sites that tell, not show. When Christine first came to me, she said, oh, talking to me, we want to talk about interactive sites. We want to talk about things that are just cool and exciting on the web. And what do you recommend? And so here's the thing where I'm going to give you a little bit of a few disclaimers and a little bit of a rationale. So first off, why do I think interactive web is important? Why do I think interactive websites are important? Well, because they're sites that tell, not just show. No, I take that back. There's sites that show. They don't just tell. Thank you. I should do that to myself. And right now we're in a place where the internet likes to tell us things. And I'd said to Christine, I was like, I did a little research. I looked at it, and to be perfectly frank, there wasn't really anything that was kind of getting me excited, turning my crank. In fact, I saw a lot of the same. And I wanted to think about less about whether or not we should do multimedia web, because I think we should. That's why we're here. But more about why I think we should. And so with that being said, I'm going to take you through what Christine has referred to as a history lesson. I feel like it's a little Fox Muldery. I hope, I feel like there's a lot of connections. And so if I sound like a little bit of a conspiracy theorist, I promise you we will get to the end. It will all make sense. Okay. I might still sound like a crank, but I made a chart. So with that being said, let's go. Where was I? So here's what I've noticed. And it wasn't just me. A lot of people have noticed this. A lot of websites have become incredibly homogenous, right? There's a lot of same happening right now, which I think immediately lends to this idea of, yes, this is why we should do multimedia, right? A little bit less of the same, a little bit more interesting. But I realize as I say this, that's a real shots fired. In fact, it puts down a lot of websites. And I want to make a couple things clear. Next slide, please, Farah. This is my disclaimer portion. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. I want to explain really clearly as I go through all of this, this is not a judgment about what I think is good or what I think is bad. It is simply what I see has happened and what the result of it is. So when I talk about simplicity, or I talk a little bit about same, or I talk a little bit about how it's hard to tell websites apart, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. And part of the reason why is that it is a result of the discipline of user experience design, which has really taken hold in the past like 15 to 20 years and has really gotten to a point now where we've streamlined things and we've perfected things to a degree. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes sites more accessible. It makes them easier for people, regardless of what your level of tech understanding is. You know where that shopping cart is. You know that the burger is going to show you more, and that's not bad, right? It just has created a certain standard and a certain level of clarity that on the one hand is very useful, but on the other hand, it means that we've also sort of plateaued a little bit and we're not really pushing ourselves anymore to create more immersive experiences. And on the one hand, that isn't a bad thing, but it's also a thing I feel a little bit sad about. Next slide. Because the internet used to be a little bit of a weird place, right? To be perfectly frank, I'm wearing this today because we felt that this was important. This is literally how I grew up online. And so this is a thing that I really believe in. I love the kids surfing the web on a literal web, surfboard. I think that's great. The internet used to be a weird place. It used to be a place where a lot of creators made platforms for themselves and their weird ideas that didn't exist before, like Homestar Runner. I mean, gosh, I feel like I'm showing my age right now. I do have some gray hair, so I think that's fair. It's places like Dancing's homepage, where you have a Yale professor who created an entire page dedicated to the art of learning the acoustic guitar. Not for profit, not because he had a guitar school, but simply because he loved playing the guitar and he thought other people would too. This is a page you can still visit if you were in the mood to go into a little bit of a time capsule on the internet. It's sites like the Blair Witch Project, which was really one of the very first viral campaigns in which this entire website was created to add a level of reality. And so that when people saw the trailer and they thought, oh God, is that real? Is this a real documentary? That they could go online and check it out. And this whole narrative had been created. It was weird and kind of spooky and crazy, but it really set up for a lot of the success of the film because it added that level of what are we looking at? And that's such an interesting and experimental place to play. It also had sites like the Internet 1996 World Exposition, which was really a collection of websites just to show off what people were building, both the emergence of professional web developers, but also people who were just creating things because they wanted to, right? The web in its infancy was a fun, strange place. So I wanted to ask this question of what happened? How did we go from this place where we saw all this text, all this craziness, all these sites being made for the sake of sites, where we see the emergence of not just a Homestar Runner, but Weeble's Place and that Badger meme. And those of you of a certain age, you're welcome. That is stuck in your head now today. I don't feel sorry about it. What happened? How did we get to here? Well, here's the thing. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't immediate either. I've gone backwards to try and figure out how we got to this place, partly for my own benefit, to make sure that I wasn't just imagining things when I saw the same. So again, original disclaimer, not a judgment, just a series of observations. I've been able to identify it out to what I think are four key elements. First, the emergence of web for profit. Two, the transformation of mobile web and how that really changed our experiences of how we access the internet. Social media, because while I know it is fun to blame social media for all sorts of things, it is actually at fault for a lot of this. And something I'm going to refer to as democratic design. And I'll break that out in a little bit. But first and foremost, let's touch on where things started to change. Let's touch on web for profit. So originally, the internet was a thing, a series of tubes, as we like to joke, that was created for organizational properties to speak to one another, otherwise known as intranet. This is where we see the emergence of the web for the use of the government, for military in the States, but also for universities and other educational bodies to allow them to bring people together to share ideas, not memes, a world of message boards, right? But as a result, the internet was really just a communication tool, or what we can actually look at it is like fax 2.0. You create something, you post something, and people see it. But then around 1993, we see the advent of commercial web or consumer available web. And in this transformation, all of a sudden, anyone could go online. And as a result, if you had a phone connection and you had a computer, you could explore the internet. And that is not necessarily in itself, again, a bad thing. In fact, it was a great thing. The commercial web and the advent of commercial web really opened up a whole new, in my opinion, renaissance for individuals, right? It created a whole new creative class, an emergence of individuals who were creating things that normally they would never have approval for or funding for. If you could code a simple rudimentary site, you could share your art with the world, whether that be doofy cartoons, a webcomic, stories and fan fiction. But the fact was, all of a sudden, individuals didn't have to go through conventional means to share their perspectives of their ideas anymore. They could just put them up online and share them with others. As a result, we also see the creation of a new economy. We see the emergence of e-commerce. We see the monetization of experiences online. And of course, the other challenges too, then we also see the rise of SEO. In the early days of the internet, especially if you were like yours truly and you really loved webcomics, if you wanted to discover new webcomics, one of the best ways to do it was to check the sidebar, where most creators would share the links to their friends' work. In other words, we were all about discovering things, but then we see the emergence of all sorts of search engines. And as a result, we then start to find things, not by accident, but by inquiring and asking. But as a result, we also see the rise of search engine optimization and the prioritization of SERP. In other words, if you get found first, then you are going to win. And that is something that can always be monetized. So then that brings us to our second point, the advent of cellular technology, but more specifically, mobile web technology and the launch of the iPhone. Because it's not that we couldn't use our phones to get online before, it's just that we always had smaller screens. My personal favorite phone was always my slider, my Samsung. I could open it up with a little keyboard, and this my little keyboard. But the screen was about this big. That's no way to experience the internet. In fact, most people would choose not to. Maybe to read an email, because we viewed it not much more different than text. But other than that, we weren't visiting sites using this kind of functionality. And then we see the launch of the iPhone in 2007, when all of a sudden that screen expands and the entire phone becomes a screen. And as a result, our phones start to transform less from devices that we make calls on to ways that we access the internet and all the different functions through it, however we so choose. And then, of course, once we start seeing the advent of apps, we're no longer going through conventional interfaces like using browsers or Google to access. We're now starting to access all these different segmented parts of the web. But I'll talk about that in just a second. Because the launch of the iPhone and therefore the access of true internet on a mobile device also resulted in a couple of key changes that also influenced website design. So mobile web required very different functions. Sites need to be smaller and faster and stronger because ultimately they were coming through weak connections, sometimes Wi-Fi, but mostly mobile data. And they also needed to not impact people's data spend. So as a result, they really had to be pared down and lightweight. They had to load without breaking and without eating up too much. And often, if you found that that wasn't happening, what they also found from the back end is that people weren't going onto Google to go to the desktop expansion. They just weren't doing it at all. And as a result, we also see the advent of adaptive design. So taking a core website, shrinking it down, but also being able to make sure that it gives a literal scaled, similar experience. Also something that no matter how you took your phone, whether you turned it this way, you'd still be able to find that interesting. And as a result, we find that people, as they're out in the world, start Googling for things and looking for things while they're on their phones. And again, remember I just said about SEO? As a result, you really want to win in the mobile space. And as a result, we then have to focus on constant optimization. We have to make sure that your website is still just as good on a mobile experience as it is on a desktop experience, because otherwise you tend to lose individuals, and that's going to impact your overall SEO. But as a result, we see more, smaller, streamlined, right? And the other thing that we also see a lot of is the impact of the vectorization of design, flattening design. We want to make sure that images and ideas come through just as clearly as they do on a little screen as they do on a big screen. Or as I like to say, it's my dumb joke that I put in here, now the earth really is flat. Rim shot, please. But I'm going to do it for myself because, anyway. So now that we know that people can go online anywhere, now that we know that people can go online at all, then brings us to our next factor, the advent of social media. Now, I like to define this into two different categories. There's the advent of social media 1.0. I often believe that GeoCities, for instance, is a very rudimentary form of social media. Individuals would go in, create websites. Yours truly learned how to code HTML because I really wanted to create a Hello Kitty fan page. I feel like if any of you are judging me, you know what you can do. But we also see the advent of platforms such as LiveJournal and MySpace and also Facebook, right? One of the things I actually do think is quite sad about the current state of social media is that I think about all the different people who were drawn to coding and programming because they wanted to trick out their MySpace page. They wanted to add blingies. They wanted to add the first, few opening seconds of Panic at the Disco to let people know what their priorities were. And now, with the way that things are, this sort of closed construction, this closed loop, I wonder how many people who could potentially have been amazing programmers have not explored that. But regardless, we're not going to talk about that. That's for another day. Social media 1.0 definitely opened up new ways of communication. They made it so that anybody could have a platform. But when we look at how it evolves, and we also look specifically not only at the dominance of Facebook, but we also look at the Facebook app and how Facebook really focuses on how it constructs things. I know it's very trendy to blame Facebook for everything. But as a result, we see that social media has completely changed how we evolve on the web and how we interact with the web. And I'll break that down in a couple of points. So one, primary mobile access. It is now, for the majority of the world, the way in which we experience the web. Don't get me wrong, Google was not an impartial third party either, but we are no longer going directly to sites, stumbling on new sites, and finding new interactions. For most people, the way in which they access the web and spend the web and how we define the web is actually through Facebook. It is the #1 mobile app in North America, with #3 being Facebook Messenger. #2 is YouTube. But as a result, it has become the primary way in which we experience the internet. And also, as a result of this, it has become the primary way in which people interact with brands. It is where they find the information that they need about brands. It's where they ask questions. It also has become the primary customer service representative. Brands now employ dedicated service professionals because of this. Consumers expect it. You can often see it on small independent businesses where people have complained and they don't get a response fast enough because they assume that regardless of the scale of your business, you are there to respond. That really deprioritizes the website in a way of finding more information about a brand. This is where the narratives are. This is where the links are. And with the introduction of shopping tools, for instance, it also means that individuals don't really have to go to a website anymore to purchase from a brand. And as a result, it's also become one of our primary channels for how we advertise. Everybody on this call who works in an agency has absolutely worked on a Facebook campaign. And as a result, the ad revenue out of their $67 billion income of 2019, 92% of it was from ad spend. And part of the other reason why we behave this way is because Facebook set up a standard really early on of penalizing individuals who put up posts that linked out of the site. They wanted to make it so that you wanted to spend all your time in Facebook. And as a result, we now do. We also spend a lot of our money there too. And that really puts websites in an interesting position because websites now are no longer just a nice thing to add. They are table stakes. Again, if you want to be found, you have to have SEO. And if you have to have SEO or SERP, then you need to have a website. And so it's this really interesting balance where all of a sudden most people engage with brands primarily through social media. They ask for questions, they check out product ranges primarily through social media. And yet we still require our websites because otherwise the chances of us being stumbled upon or being discovered are really, really low. But when we also set that standard that you need a website to run a business, regardless of what your business is, not everybody has the access to work with an organization like mine or potentially yours or talent like yours to help them build something that will help them be found. And so as a result of this, we see the dominance of an emerging technology, right? I call it democratic design because I do think it's still a very good thing. I think it's an important thing. But we see website builders, for instance, GeoCities evolved into something else. And what we see is that they've created a standard because now anybody can design a website. And that's not me gatekeeping. That's actually a big rah-rah on my part, right? If you know how to use PowerPoint, you can build a website. And I think that's a great thing. But it has also created a certain standard, a standard of simplicity, right? Things have to be easy. They have to be user optimized. And they also have to be so that anybody can update it themselves and not be confused and break those elements in the back end. So now we also have easily accessible builds. Right? We don't necessarily prioritize a multimedia or a high touch experience because we understand that not everybody can do that. So we really prioritize elegant and adaptable sites. But as a result, we've also put a lot of this information out onto the web in this sort of standard, and we've created sort of a standard of same, because now this is what we expect a website should act and behave like. And again, when you add in the other factor, the dominance of social media as a way of reaching businesses, websites have been largely transformed into business cards. They're no longer about individual experiences. They're about utility, replicability, and being found. And so, with all that being said, this is my more dominant way of putting it. This is how the web got boring, right? Once I went through all this, I realized this wasn't actually in my head, or maybe it is in my head, but I made a chart so it makes me feel like it's valid. Right, first we see the commercialization of the web. We see the advent of the first web browsers. We also see the first sort of web builders like a GeoCities as an example. But also as a result, we see the prioritization of SEO. So when we get to the advent of mobile web in 2007, we really recognize that you need to have an adaptable site. And an adaptable site has to be a streamlined site. It has to be a pared down site. And then, of course, when we add into that the emergence of contemporary social media as an example, and we see how that kind of bridges in between, and then how they made it quickly easy and adaptable to be on the mobile web, we then see how dominant it becomes. It's actually easier to use Facebook on a mobile app, as an example, than it is to access most websites. And then as a result, we see the wide adoption of democratic design. If I want to have a site and I know that it has to contribute to my SEO, to build up my SERP so that I can bring greater visibility for my business, but I'm also on Facebook and I'm also on Instagram and I'm also on Pinterest, we then see a wide adoption of democratic design, making websites simpler, smaller, easier. And all you have to do is put in your text and change your colors. And as a result, we even see heavy hitters like GoDaddy, which has always been associated with web hosting, also start playing in the website builder game, because ultimately you need to buy a domain, plus you need to build a site to put on it. And then, of course, because I'm a dork, just to show it's not just all in my head, I have also included the original Facebook and Chrome logos to show you how they become flattened and vectorized over time, because this has really become the standard of how we design logos, how we design images, and how we design web experiences. And yes, for you eagle-eyed design nerds out on the call, I have used only flat images in this. That was on purpose. Thank you for noticing. So now it is the year of our Lord 2020 to use a meme. And that is how we got here. So it wasn't just in my head. Or maybe it was how I stitched it all together. But this is how I think we got here. But that's not the purpose of this exercise, right? The purpose of this exercise is to talk about the interactive web. Or as I like to think about instead, what happens next? Now that we've created the standard of same, knowing that we have the skills, the technology, and the ability to make things different, to make them more exciting. The question then becomes, why, when we're faced with these challenges of I have to build a site, why would I choose to make something more tactile, more complicated, and maybe a little bit weirder than to just go ahead and create something that is simple, streamlined, and elegant? Those are good questions. So I have pulled out what I believe are 4 core principles about why you should create something interactive. And I hope that they inspired you to ask similar questions of your own clients or to ask questions like that of us, because these are the questions I like to ask when I like to ask myself, should we make it weird? So the first principle, the power of surprise. While I'm never going to pretend that social media is going to go overnight, it's not. But I would like us to start believing that the website can be a destination again, that we can create something that excites people, or that when they do land on it, they experience something that they weren't expecting. So I like to ask questions like, what would it mean to design to go beyond SEO? And instead prompt one-to-one user sharing. What if I wanted to design something to make a person look at something and go, I have to share this with my friends? I don't think anyone has done that with me in probably about 15 years. So I would love to consider, how could I create something that's so compelling, so touchable that people want to share it, right? How would a site change if it wasn't to sell an experience, but it was to be an experience all on its own? Right? How could I do this if I wasn't just looking to fill a cart, but I was also looking to blow someone's mind and then fill the cart? How would that transform the experience? And the other thing I also like to ask too is, in what ways could interactivity actually add to the user experience and to help the sales process? Which brings me to my next point. And this is something that I don't know if anyone else calls it this, but this is something that I've been obsessed with for a little while. This notion of using the web or using web experiences to create an analogous experience. And I think this is really important for a few things. We as human beings like analogies. They help us learn, especially when something is complex or really future state, to understand that something is like this in principle, if not like that, is a really great way of bringing that to life. But analogy is often used in words. So I always like to ask these questions. Can we say that we are unique or that we're innovative if our website looks like everything else? It is one thing to say it with words. It is another thing to create something that is actually unique and innovative. I think there's no better way of walking our talk. Is how we describe what we're currently doing with language an effective learning tool? Are we just giving people words to say, yes, okay, this checks my boxes? Oh, hi, SEO. Or are we actually helping people learn? And then, of course, that also brings me to the next question. Are we leveraging our site as an opportunity to inform, as an information gathering exercise, or is it intended to create understanding? Are we marrying words with experiences to really help people overcome gaps? And I think that that is a really important question, especially when we're dealing with complex ideas. I also think that, again, if you're going to walk your talk, your site is a salesperson. I think it should be. So the question then becomes, what kind of value are you bringing as a sales tool? Because ultimately, we don't want to hear from salespeople who are a little bit dry and a little bit boring. We want people who are passionate and people who get us excited. So I like to ask another set of questions when it comes to how do we bring value to using the web to create stories? Are we creating an experience or are we creating a path? Are we just having a little touch base before we make the sale conversion, or is this part of the process? When we're looking at our sales team, how much effort is actually involved in the sale? How much work actually has to go into it to get people to sign a contract? So is the site a destination or is a stop towards conversion? And how much effort can the site actually put into this process to make the sales job easier? And then, of course, again, how can we use technology to answer questions and reduce barriers and aid in our objectives so that when someone finally hears from a salesperson, they already feel informed and confident, and what they really just need is a human to help them take it home? And then finally, I like to consider this as well, because again, I want to make this really clear. It is not that I do not care about user experience. I love streamlined and elegant design, and I care very much about accessibility. But what I think is also important too is in the prioritization of UX, are we really considering what a user experience looks like? Are we putting our end user first? Right? Are we actually looking at our targets' challenges? Do they actually require simplicity, refinement, ease of access, or do they need something else? Do they need to laugh? Do they need to explore? Do they need to feel like they've landed on something cool and interesting? And if we circumvent our expectations, if we actually show them something different, does that actually help us deliver our business goals? Is it greater than fulfillment? It's not just enough to make a sale. Does this actually help increase affinity or preference? Which also leads me to the last question. How do we really differentiate from the competition? Right? How can we stand out and how can we say we're different if we're actually producing something that's all the same? And these are just questions I like to ask along the process as I start to try and push this idea of how do we just go beyond creating a page into something that is tangible and exciting and interesting. But I won't lie to you. I also have an absolutely like personal motivation in this and also in this conversation as well. And that is I want to keep the internet weird, right? I really want to go back to that idea of doing things for the sake of doing them. We can absolutely have a commercialized web and deliver against business objectives and still make it an interesting and fun place to be. I want to be on the web because I want to be there, not just because I need to find out what your business hours are. And so I think with that being said, I'm going to pass this over to Cody, who's going to take you through how I think interactivity can make websites a little more fun and hopefully a little bit more weird.
Thanks, Helen. I'll just do a quick little intro here. Um, Essentially, what we want to do now is take everything that Helen's just laddered up to and talk about some examples of one, types of technology, protocols, things like that, that we think are great and that we love to leverage. And then a little bit of application conversation. Feel free to put questions in the chat. We'll make sure to answer them after we get through this. But without further ado, Cody is going to tell us about WebSockets.
Thanks, guys. So, yeah, the first tech we're going to talk about today is WebSockets, and I guess that brings up the question, what is a WebSocket? And the best way to describe it is that it's a protocol. And the next question is, what is a protocol? Well, a protocol is basically a set of rules that two or more entities need to follow in order to communicate with each other. And alluding to kind of what Helen touched on, she already touched on analogies, and I'm actually going to use an analogy to explain what a WebSocket is and how it works versus an ordinary web request. So let's say I wanted to ask Christine a question, and I was going to do that over an ordinary web request, and I'm going to use a cell phone as my analogy. If I wanted to ask that question, I would have to find Christine in my contact list, call her, wait for her to answer. She would answer my question, and then she would hang up on me, and I wouldn't have another chance to ask her another question unless I called her back. If I was on a WebSocket connection with Christine, I could call her and ask that same question and she could answer. But the key difference there is that that connection remains open, and it's kind of like both of us being on speakerphone. And that's really a big difference between an ordinary web request, because that opens up the possibility for either one of us to ask each other a question at any given point in time. And that makes for some really powerful experiences. WebRTC in specific, it's kind of like WebSockets, but it's a more peer-to-peer version. So there's no central server involved in the communication. If I have a WebSocket connection and I want to talk to Christine, all of my messages have to go through some central server in order to get passed over to her. On a WebRTC connection, we need to do that same sort of handshake to establish and say, hey, I am who I say I am, and she is who she says she is, and now we can talk to each other. But then we don't have to use that central server. We can just talk to each other directly. And the big application of WebRTC these days is for video and audio. So video conferencing, like Google Meet, for example, is all facilitated by a technology like WebRTC.
And I got to jump in and do a quick plug from the previous slide, if you don't mind going back one, Farah. One great example of a WebSocket connection that's a little different than, say, two computers talking to each other for video is like this bottom right example here, where we actually built a game that used your cell phone as the controller and that used the desktop as the game screen. And why this is so cool and why WebSockets is the way to make this work is essentially because of the low latency, which is super fun. We'll get into that on the next slide as well. In terms of what does this mean for you? You might be thinking, how do I make my web not boring? What kind of way can I use WebSockets in this kind of way to make something different and interesting? Well, a few kind of key principles that WebSockets, aka having that phone screen or having that open phone line, if you will, are. One is tools like collaboration tools. And a really good example of this is Google Docs, where you can see people working in it. You're working in the same time in real time. Yes, of course, this is a massive product that Google has built, but there are a lot of ways that we can integrate something like this into a site. And we want to think about content first. So when you think about your brand and you think about what having an ongoing connection that allows broadcasting from multiple different devices looks like, it could be a collaborative art tool, it could be a message board, it could be a number of different things. But if you think of Google Docs as your basis and know that that's possible without being Google, that's a really great place to start. As we mentioned before, games, WebSockets allows us to build all kinds of more complicated and interesting games that allow for really quick feedback between multiple people. So it's really strong in a multiplayer universe, but also potentially using multiple devices, as we mentioned on the previous slide. And then last but not least, and this is a kind of personal favorite, is we call it, I hate the word phygital, but it's the best way to put it. Stuff that is bridging the digital and physical world. So think about hitting a button on your computer and seeing a real-time reaction in a physical device. Like that kind of thing is supported via this kind of protocol. And I think that it's one of our most kind of underutilized abilities. And when we think about making our sites more user-friendly or based on what the users might actually want, we can think of applications across retail and many other different kind of verticals to maybe take advantage of an ability to connect the digital and physical and have that open communication and collaborative environment, which is really exciting.
Thanks, Christine. The next one we want to talk about is WebGL, and I think this is like sort of the buzzword in the internet these days. And I think when we hear the word WebGL, we automatically associate it with 3D graphics and specifically 3D in websites. And while it is that, it's kind of a lot more than that. So an example of 3D that we have done, you see in the top right there, that's actually a virtual trade show booth that we created. We created this sort of immersive, interactive trade show experience because obviously over the past year or so, we haven't been able to do these in real life. So the next closest thing to be able to do it in real life is to experience it as close as possible in a digital way. So that's a good example of WebGL in 3D. But it's more than just a 3D graphics rendering engine. It's also really good at 2D. So the digital art world and sort of generative art is really big with creative developers these days. They kind of draw on a lot of history too. A lot of them have been using sort of historical algorithms and stuff to create brand new art pieces. And they're actually using WebGL for a lot of those art pieces and WebGL's rendering engine to create, sort of high definition, unique digital art. And then another thing that we can do using WebGL is actually not to render any graphics at all, but just to just leverage the engine, because the key thing about the WebGL engine is that it taps into the computer's GPU, which is the graphics processing unit. And without getting too far into, sort of the hardware tech of it, long story short, the GPU can run a lot more things in parallel than the CPU can, which means it can do things a lot faster. So on the bottom, we have an example of a campaign we did for Wrangler. And what we did was we trained a model in the cloud to recognize a Wrangler logo in many different shapes and sizes and different lighting. And then we leveraged the WebGL engine in real time so that users could take photos of themselves and send those to our model. And we were running a detection in the cloud to say, hey, this is a Wrangler logo, this isn't. And they were able to receive unlockables based on that technology. So my point here is that WebGL, while it is 3D and that's probably its main application, there's so many more different experiences that we can create using that technology that we maybe don't even realize were possible.
Awesome. And what types of things might we think about here? Obviously, the key thing, as Cody mentioned, was, one of the main applications is creating 3D worlds. That it really allows us to essentially create video game-like environments on the web. And cool transitions that we can borrow from film. As Cody mentioned, again, it's not just 3D, so we can do a lot programmatically with this. And I think it's a big, broad topic, so I didn't want to get too specific here, but I'd be happy to talk in the discussion after around what specific applications are. But some of the things that we talk about when we talk about what Helen was mentioning around the web becoming so homogenous is like, this is a really great way to stand out. What if your portfolio site was a video game you could walk through and walk up to the different projects and play them? What if your brand needed a story to be told about the history behind it, and there was more interactivity, more of a kind of crouching narrative? So the two kind of key pillars that are really less tactical and more around how to make that experience good is the standing out in the storytelling. I think the applications are just infinite and so exciting and so good for the ability to stand out amongst your competitors. And then the last way is, just thinking about visualizing things in a different way. We've, as Helen mentioned, we've gotten so used to this kind of boxy, e-com driven, SEO driven design language that we kind of know what to expect. If you're selling a bicycle, for instance, you expect to see a carousel of 3 or 4 images of it, maybe one's lifestyle, maybe one's like a close-up of a feature, and some text and specs in a table below, and that, Bob's your uncle. But like, what do you do to be different? We could have, and I love this little like skull version here. What do we want to say that's different? Maybe your bicycle could be an exploded view that you navigate through like you're flying through space, and you're able to really see the difference and see the animation around how the spokes work, if that's something that I'm not a bicycle expert, obviously, but you might want to be able to actually see how the gears turn if it's different, or what is the difference between a fixie and a multi-gear bike, in a way that's so much more interactive and informative than just a few images and a text and specs description below.
Thanks, Christina. That kind of brings me straight into this point. This like kind of has two meanings. So like Helen and Christina have touched on, we've come to know certain things and certain standards in the web, and there's no reason that we can't continue to use those. But I think there's, tons of different ways that we can keep familiar sort of elements and UX patterns while at the same time creating a brand new experience that people are just going to intuitively be able to go through, without having to, spend a ton of time discovering or trying to figure out how, what they're using is actually meant to work. And it also means that we don't have to build everything from scratch. So there are a ton of tools out there already that are being used in, specific ways and applications, and we can kind of tap into those tools and use them for ourselves and create brand new experiences, with these integrations to create something totally different that hasn't been done before. So the first thing we're touching on, and I'm sure everybody's heard of this, is Google Maps and Street View. But if we're referring to Google Maps and Street View, it doesn't mean that we're just going from, using these technologies to map something out or going from point A to point B. There's so much more you can do with Maps and Street View. So this example you see here on this slide, in specific, it was a project for a movie called Geostorm. And what we actually did was we let users choose basically any location on Earth using Street View, and brought them to that location, and then sort of overlaid this digital weather pattern to emulate what the movie could do, and basically this big machine that could create weather patterns at any given point in any given place on Earth. So it's just one example of a unique way that Street View and a combination of Street View and WebGL can be used to create a new experience. The second one is Google Vision. This one I could probably spend an hour talking about just on Google Vision itself. But long story short, Google Vision is a set of computer vision tools that Google's built that anybody is able to use. So some examples of tools that we can use are face detection, text detection, logo detection, what's called web detection, and that's kind of what you're seeing in the GIF here. You can upload an image and it will intuitively describe that image, the mood of the image. It will pick objects and text out of the image, and you can gain a whole bunch of information from that. And there's tons of different experiences that we could create leveraging this tech. There's no reason that we would have to build something like face detection or web detection from scratch when these tools are already built. But that's not to say that we can't use those tools and create something new that we haven't seen before.
One of my personal favorites, and what I think is most underused ability we have online, is to create browser extensions. There are Chrome extensions, Firefox extensions, Edge extensions. And they're kind of interchangeable in that they all give us similar kind of abilities. In the background GIF here, you can see a Chrome extension that we built for The Good Place, the TV show. And it did all kinds of things. It takes over your homepage. It takes over all the things that kind of Google owns on the internet, YouTube, thumbs up and thumbs down, turns into Good Place, Bad Place. But the biggest one, and I think this is the greatest example of it, is that we were able to essentially replace all swears on the internet, if you have this Chrome extension installed and turned on, with their not so sweary anti-cusses, if you will, and you can see the example of that. So why is this cool? Why is this something we can use? It's best for a brand that already has affinity, that already has people that are going to be willing to install something that is branded or that is, a tool. So you want it to be useful, you want it to be fun, you want it to be interesting, but essentially we can take over so many things on the internet, and we can actually change the way that the user views the internet based on a principle like this one. And so I'm sure you can imagine the incentives are endless. It's really great for retail. You can create shopping tools that tell people when a sale is on. You can create, I'm sure many people have used Invisible Hand, which is a Chrome extension that tells you if there's a deal or a promotion on a site that you're on. But often these tools are created by kind of individuals that have something to do. But I think we could really turn this on its head and say, what if we create something useful that is branded, that people have in their internet browser all the time? Really fun. That's it.
The next one's IBM Watson, and similar to Google Vision API, I could probably spend an hour talking about this too. IBM Watson is more surrounded around artificial intelligence applications. So some examples of tools they have are speech to text, text to speech, sentiment analysis. And we've actually applied those in a couple of unique ways. The example you're seeing here um, is a lie detector booth that we had both an activation for and a web experience for. So in the activation, just to give you some context, there were a bunch of sensors that we were able to use. We could get heart rate and perspiration and things like that, and try and come up with an accurate lie detector. And then when we try and create that in the web, obviously we can't use those same sensors because it's not like we're going to ship everybody a heart rate sensor or whatever to use the website. So we need to come up with a way to create the same thing virtually, and we fell upon IBM Watson, and we were able to use a combination of sort of the laptop's camera to detect facial expressions and mood based on that, and also they were actively having a conversation with the site, and we were using their tone and sentiment analysis from the words and diction they were choosing to use in that conversation to try and emulate this sort of lie detector experience. So that's just a small sample of something we could possibly do leveraging IBM Watson's artificial intelligence. Another one is Twilio and SendGrid. These two tools pretty much let us do anything we want to with phone calls, text messages, and email. So we've actually built some experiences in the past that have been, I'll call them bots for lack of a better term. Like you could have a phone conversation with a virtual person, or, especially in sort of sales applications or customer service applications, you could build a bot to interact with your users and have a conversation. Maybe they have some questions they need to ask or a problem they're trying to solve. And it's a good way to sort of automate that process and prevent the need to having an actual person, taking those calls. And I'm sure many of us have called our phone company or bank or something in the past, and you get that robot voice that tells you, hey, do you have any questions? And, it'll try and help you along because oftentimes it'll be able to answer your questions without passing you through to an actual person.
And I think last but not least in our fun list of tools is one of my favorites. It's called Descript. And this is a tool that it was initially built for like podcasters and people that do audio editing and things like that. But one of my favorite things that is kind of creepy and also awesome is that there's a tool within Descript that basically uses machine learning to recreate voices. And you can have somebody, and knowing if you work with talent and you want to be able to kind of squeeze as much of it of them as possible, you can have them read like a 10 to 15 minute script and literally create a digital version of their voice that you can type and then have it feedback. A funny little personal story is my husband's a programmer and is also obsessed with this, and he made a bot using something like Twilio, but he made his own with his voice and my voice and made them talk to each other. And yes, the results were very funny. But thinking about using this in the real world or in various inclusions, you can create a unique voice. You can create a voice out of a character, so it could have really unique uses in games and interactivity. Or you can essentially build out all kinds of different things, but very fun. Check out the tool for sure. And this brings us to questions and answers. I think we all are able to stay on past the 5 minutes. So don't feel bad. Throw up some questions either in the chat, and whoever out of Cody, Helen, or I are the right people to answer will jump in. I can kind of send up. We've got from Ben, how do you balance solid UX principles with a less boring approach to design? Helen, you want to take that one?
I feel like that's a little bit of a difficult one for me to answer because I am not a UX designer, right? But I do think that uh, let's put it this way. Not to speak on behalf of UX designers anywhere. And I feel like if there is one on the call and they're like, what? I'm like, I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. User experience is really just about really optimizing that path and looking at how individuals use a site, how they navigate the site, right? How they move through it. I don't think that they're antithetical to great and immersive experiences at all. I think that we just sort of decided that they were, that things had to be streamlined and clean and simple, that we also had to make sure that, you know, it looks streamlined, clean and simple. But I don't think they're fundamentally oppositional to each other. I think that they absolutely can work in hand with each other. And if somewhere there's a UX experience designer who's like, how very dare you? You are very wrong. I'm very sorry. And I will try and brief you differently.
Nice. Next question is from Bonnie. Okay, how do you convince brands to get weird if they think they want simplicity? I think Helen and I are probably good ones for that. I mean, and Helen, jump in, but for me, it's like, what is the goal and how are we trying to get them there? So if the goal makes sense for simplicity, then maybe that's okay, but if the goal is to connect on an emotional level, or if the goal that we're trying to kind of achieve with a brand whenever they approach us with something to do, usually there's a between the lines thing. It's not just we want to sell more X, it's we want to position ourselves in a certain way, we want to position ourselves as a certain kind of brand, or affiliate with various types of people, be attracted to different types of targets. Usually there's a way in there, and so I think as long as when we're advising brands and talking to brands about the why, what are you trying to achieve, and how does this ladder up to it, that's usually the best way, and at least in my opinion. I don't know, Helen, if you had anything to add or adjust.
Well, I think the only other thing I'd probably add, because I was like, yep, is that notion of the end user, right? Putting the end user first and what they're looking for. I think that if the data shows it, I think it absolutely should indicate that, right? And that's the thing. It's like, I'm not advocating for the discarding of simplicity. I think that there are lots of targets and use purposes in which, people are looking for simplicity or want things a little bit easier. Right. And I'm not going to poo-poo that at all. But I do think if there is evidence that people want to play with things, that they like to discover things, that this is something that is part of it. And I think the other question too is also like, again, like Chrissy was saying, a little bit of like, what's that narrative you're trying to tell? Right. Because I think for me, if you were to say, oh gosh, I feel like I'm showing a little bit of how the sausage is made. I think for me, the question often becomes like, what is everybody else doing? And how do we stand out? Right? How do we make something a little bit more interesting? And so I really like to sit down with my clients and really kind of figure out how to create a shared vision for their brand on the web. And I think if there's a lot of data that shows otherwise, or shows that like, there's something that indicates that this is a great idea, then I think we should always push for it, right? And we should always show people what is possible. Because I think that's the other thing too. It's like often people don't seek it out, or they feel a little bit intimidated by it because they feel like it's not possible for them, or it's not possible for their brand. It's not within their reach. It doesn't fit them. And I think when you can help clients see how it is possible and how it fits them, I think, that's always a great way to do it. And I agree. Yes, there's so many other factors beyond UX that contribute to user experience, right? I think that is, essentially yes. But Patrick is definitely much more of an expert on it than I am. But yes, that's how I like to encourage clients to push a little beyond.
I think I can probably take the next two here. I'll try and squeeze them in
That's
2
code
minutes if I
town.
can. So to answer your question, what are some of my favorite uses of WebGL WebSockets? Maybe I'll say, talk about WebSockets in this one. I think for me, being able to use WebSockets in applications that are outside of just websites. So we've done a few activations in the past where we're able to tie WebSockets into the experience. And one that comes to mind right away is our experience for Shawn Mendes. Long story short, the experience was a day in the life of Shawn Mendes, and there were, 3 different sort of stations that you could do something at and create sort of a digital takeaway based on, what you're doing in those stations. So there was like a mock recording booth. You could, do a little bit of a karaoke and it was filming you. You could do a stage experience, kind of to simulate what it'd be like for Sean to come out to a crowded concert. So the whole time users wouldn't have even realized it, but they were all part of this sort of connected WebSocket experience. And as they were scanning into stations, we were able to track where everybody was at any given time in that experience. And by virtue of that, when they got to the end, we were able to use, actually we used Twilio and SendGrid as well in that project. We were able to send them a digital takeaway by email, with their videos and their photos from that whole experience that they probably didn't even realize that they were going to receive at the end of that experience. So I guess to answer your question, being able to use WebSockets on more than just websites is what gets me really excited about that tech. And then the next one, Michael has a question suggesting about any resources to learn WebGL or WebSockets. I'm actually going to paste you the URL in the chat here. This guy has created probably the best portfolio website I've ever seen, and he used WebGL to do so. So shameless advertising for him and what he's created, but he's actually spent the last year or so putting together a very comprehensive WebGL and 3JS tutorial, or it's less of a tutorial and more like a university class almost in WebGL, but it's everything from ground up to some of the most advanced tech that he's been using in WebGL over the past few years. So if you have no experience with WebGL or even a little bit of experience, I guarantee you there's several different topics in his class that you can learn something new from. So definitely check out that link if you haven't already.
And look at that, we're a 501. We've actually thought we might go a little over, but thank you all for the people that are still here for joining us today to talk about the nerdy web. If you have more questions that come up, you can reach out to us at our names at Thinking Box or info at Thinking Box, and it'll get funneled to the right person. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us today and letting us talk about the stuff that makes us all really happy.